Okay, we are answering some of yours and other people's questions. Let's get into it. Question: how do you think the 2020 presidential elections will take place? Via mail, like many want, or going to our registered places to vote, like the current president wants? Oh boy, I do not know. That's a toughie. Nothing is going to change by November. The virus is still going to be around. I don't think there's going to be a vaccine. September, October, you know, honestly, there might be. But they have to decide, no, it's early November, so there is a small chance that there will be a vaccine, but it would have to be there in time before they make all the plans for whether it's voting in person or by mail or a combination of both. Okay, so probably what we will get is a combination of voting by mail and in person. I don't see them closing down in-person voting. I mean, people are going to the grocery store. People the economy is opening up. Businesses are opening up. I see that polling places will open up, but I think there's probably going to be an option to vote by mail. Okay, so some of your vocabulary is absentee ballot. That would be voting by mail. If you fit certain requirements, you can always vote by mail, but you have to usually fit certain requirements. But what they would do is they would just waive some requirements to make more people available for absentee ballot. Election integrity or election fraud. Some people are worried that the mail opens up more chances for fraud. And secret ballot, having people know what you vote or not. So here's what I value in voting. Number one, I value more people voting is a good thing. The more we can get people to vote, the better. Okay, so I am in favor of anything that makes it easier to vote. Personal opinion, I think voter fraud is very low, and I don't think we're ever going to be able to get rid of it. I think it's a nature of the beast. It's always there. Okay, so I'm in favor of expanding the voting as long as it will not create an abnormal amount of voter fraud. Okay, so they have to look at that. But here's my big problem, and we've already had mail-in votes for local school districts. Okay, I am a big supporter, and in fact, locally, New York State Constitution says we as citizens have a right for a secret ballot. We have that right. You can't have the government seeing how you voted. That's for your own protection. And I went through, and there are far too many places for a mail-in ballot locally for the school board election where human beings could see how I voted. That is incredibly disturbing. Do you want the government of the United States, the federal government, to know how you voted? And if you are putting your name on the envelope with a signature, they can say that they don't associate your name with your vote, but how can you prove that? When you vote in person, your signature is never on or the voting ballot, and your voting ballot is never next to your signature. When you vote mail-in, this is at least for the local elections, when you vote mail-in, your voting ballot is inside the envelope with your name written right across the top and your signature. Supposedly, when it's worked perfectly, they separate your ballot from your envelope, but there's still that moment when somebody could see it, and that does not happen in the way we do it locally in a regular in-person electing. So I have extreme worries about secret ballot. If we were to be forced to vote by mail, I think there probably won't be that, personal opinion, that too much fraud, and it might or might not increase the amount of people who vote. I don't know. So this is very exciting to see what will happen, because it is a shift in how we participate in our democracy. Further research, why don't you look up whether mail-in voting will increase or decrease election fraud? And maybe some people have done some studies. Will mail-in voting increase or decrease percentage of people voting? I think those two questions are great for further research. Okay, the question is, what is redlining? Well, redlining was a practice. Let's do the definition first. Redlining was a practice of drawing a red line around primarily black and minority neighborhoods in cities. And then lending institutions would not give mortgages and lend money to the people in those neighborhoods, and thus the people in a redlined neighborhood couldn't borrow money to buy a house, and businesses could not borrow money to start businesses in that neighborhood. And the effect was that minority neighborhoods could not borrow the money because everyone needs to borrow money to buy a house. That's how it's done. It's how it was done for the vast majority of people. Same with a business. And the minority families in those redlined neighborhoods could not borrow money to own their own home or their own business. That's the definition of redlining. It was legal and is now illegal. So a second level definition of redlining, now that you know what it was, is redlining is one of the three undisputed, unarguable, legal, used to be legal, things that were done to black Americans over the history of America that were discriminatory and, everyone agrees, very, very horrible and bad. And so you will hear, because it is uncontroversial that these were bad, and they really, really harmed black Americans. So you will hear redlining in the three. It will say slavery, Jim Crow, redlining. So up until the mid-1800s, slavery was legal. No one today can argue that it was a good thing. Everyone is on the same page saying it was bad and it hurt black Americans. After slavery was made illegal after the Civil War, discriminatory laws, segregation laws, were lumped together and called Jim Crow laws. Today, there is no controversy that these laws were bad, they hurt black Americans, and these laws were made illegal in the 1960s. Redlining kept going from the 1960s to the late 1970s. It was that legal non-giving of loans to minority Americans. Today, there is no controversy. It is considered bad. The effect was very negative, and it was made illegal in the late 1970s. So you will always hear slavery, Jim Crow, and redlining used in the same sentence when you want to say governmental, legal discrimination that hurt minority and black Americans. Redlining was made illegal in the late 1970s. For your further research, you should really look into how has redlining affected people today. Because if it was made illegal in the 1970s, we are literally only talking 40 years later. So something that was happening in the 70s can definitely have effects on people today. Like, I was born in the 70s, so something happening in the 70s would have affected baby me. So there's people, I'm not that old, so there are tons of people around that were affected by redlining. So you can definitely look into how had this, and of course you could do it with Jim Crow. You know, before 1965, discrimination was legal, and so you could do it with Jim Crow. But but the redlining is not as well known as the discrimination segregation law. So look into how has redlining affected people and families. How does it continue to affect people and families today? Okay, question. What are your thoughts on the zoo theory and the idea that we may be under galactic quarantine to prevent mind-melding culture shock, all the while being watched by extraterrestrial scientists from our closest co-orbitable body called Earth's greatest companion, which is 38 times further from the Earth than the Moon? Makes sense to me. Yeah, if I was a super intelligent extraterrestrial species, I wouldn't want the humans to spread either. I spend most of my time trying to stay away from other people, so this makes perfect sense. Keep the humans in the solar system. Pretend like we're not there. Could you imagine? They're like all past Pluto and stuff, being like, shh, don't tell them we're out there. Just, yeah. Now I could see that. Okay. Here's the thing, though. It's like literally, how would you know what they call the Earth's greatest companion? How would you know they call it that? And 38 times further from the Earth than the Moon? Well, we should actually. It can't be. It can't be unless they have some sort of gravitational cloaking device for whatever they are. We know all the major gravitational bodies 38 times further from the Moon, but I guess if they were on a small asteroid, we would never know it. So, probability of zoo theory? It makes logical sense. However, I really think we're more in a simulation, like Elon Musk says. You might want to look into this one. So further research. Are we living in a simulation? I'm going to butcher this idea, but the idea is the fact that there's such billions of years and billions of... There has to be intelligent life somewhere, and if there's intelligent life, it doesn't take very long to get to the things called computers. So if there's intelligent life, they must have computers, and computers, within just a couple hundred years, create artificial intelligence. And once you have a computer with artificial intelligence, you can run a simulation of a universe within a universe. And once your so think about it. We're within 100 years of creating a computer so powerful it can simulate its own little universe. So we are there, like right now, within 100 years, with the technology we have, or the technology we're thinking about. So we're going to create a universe within our universe. And then, as that simulation in our computer is running, those artificially intelligent, simulated peoples, well, they're going to get to a time when they can create computers and they can create a simulation, and those simulated people could create a new simulation inside the simulation. So I think you could look it up. Elon Musk proposes that there's a high probability that we are in one of those simulations within a simulation that was created by a simulated culture That's what keeps me up at night. You might also like looking at The Truman Show, a fairly good movie with Jim Carrey about it's just The Truman Show, about being kind of in a zoo. Just watch it. It's pretty good. Okay, why weren't the Nazis overthrown before World War II? Okay, so we can look at that question in two different ways. Overthrown by other countries. So why wasn't Hitler stopped in the 1930s by other countries? Or why didn't the people rise up in a coup and overtake the Nazis? Okay, well, it starts with the Nazi Party. You have to remember, the Nazi Party was democratically elected. Okay, they got elected into a democracy, and Hitler was elected as a chancellor through the democracy. And they assumed basically total political control in 1933 when the Capitol building, the Parliament building called the Reichstag, was burnt. Okay, so then they were even more voted into office. They were a law and order party. There was a lot of fear going on. It was the World Depression. Okay, the Parliament had just been arsoned. Okay, so they had a lot of popular support getting into that position of power in 1933. It wasn't ultimate popular support, okay, but it was enough. And after the Reichstag burning, they had even more support. Once they had support, like a good majority of support, they then got rid of other political parties and instituted a totalitarian government. It is not that easy to overthrow a totalitarian government, okay? It is not easy to have a revolution when the government is in control of the military. The Nazi Party was in control of the German military and their own sort of military, so two forces of military. They had the support of a lot of the percentage of Germans. They were also recruiting young boys into the Hitler Youth and young girls into the League of German Girls. There was a heavy propaganda machine to get the citizens of Germany and the youth on board with their government. It was during the Depression, and one of the quotes I remember is someone says, one of the Hitler Youth, now older, said it was movement for movement's sake. The Nazi Party moved the government. They moved it with parades. They moved it with factories. They rearmed the military. They ignored the Treaty of Versailles. They had rally upon rally. They had propaganda on the radio. They had propaganda on the movies. Things were moving. And all the citizens had to do was fall in line and walk with where the country was moving, where the Nazi Party was leading them. So there were plenty of people who didn't like where the Nazi Party was moving, but how do you go from a small percentage or even a medium percentage of people that didn't agree with where the government was going into a revolution? How do you do that? And remember, it was only 6 years. 6 years. 1933 through 1939. 6 years goes by really, really quickly. And you have to remember, the things that we know today of the Holocaust, the sheer murder, genocide of millions of people happened during the war. It didn't happen. The sheer murder and genocide did not happen to millions before World War II. So we get to the question, why would other countries overthrow Germany? Other countries were scared of Germany, but they were also scared of war. So they tried peace, and the League of Nations tried peace to try to stop Hitler and from expanding the power of Germany. So you're not going to get a revolution inside Germany, and the other countries weren't going to go to war until everything boiled over into World War II. And then you had resistance within Germany and even assassination attempts on Hitler's life during the war. And of course, the other countries of Europe, some of them went to war with Hitler, but that was during the war, World War II. But for those 6 years leading up to it, it would just be too difficult to overthrow that Nazi party. That's a simplified version of it. All right. Why do humans feel the need to be so technological? Farming technological advancements, etc. What was so wrong with simple hunting and gathering and a simple way of life? Well, the answer is there's really nothing wrong with hunting and gathering, and to some degree farming on a farm village. And it really isn't so bad whatsoever. There's a lot of free time. There's a lot of relaxing. There's pretty much all the food you need, okay? It really is, I don't want to say lazy, but it is a really, really simple and relaxing way of life, for sure. There's some negatives, okay? You don't have things and stuff, okay? But you do have clothes and you do have shelter. Life expectancy is lower, okay? Medicine is not really that existing, okay? So you don't have medicine, and you don't have variety of things. But the trade-off is there's very little stress and there's a lot of relaxing, okay? What was so wrong with it? Well, basically, humans ran out of space in the world. We grew in population, so much so that there was population pressure, and basically humans had to figure out a way to feed new growth. And once humans learned how to farm, and that's the vocab, the Neolithic Revolution, once humans learned how to farm, we could make food and our population grew. And once that starts, it starts a cycle that forever will leave hunting and gathering and farming villages behind. We're able to get enough food to get specialized workers, to get cities. And once you create a city, there's no going back, okay? So once you know how to create cities, someone will always create a city and take over all the local farms. And you better create a city, because someone else is going to create a city and take you over if you don't have a city. Once it starts, there's no putting the genie back in the bottle. You can't go back because someone already knows how to be a city. And it's a more efficient, more powerful way of living. And so whether it's good or bad or fun or not, it's more powerful and it takes over. The ideas of cities, the ideas of technology, okay? The ideas of what we call civilization. Now, it is very interesting to note that many technological advancements only start happening around 1700. So we go from like negative 5000 BC all the way up to 1700. I mean, they were plowing in Ireland right before the World War I the same way they were plowing 3,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, okay? So technology as you know it really only started very, very, very recently. I get it, there were swords and armors and crossbows and stuff, but those are simple, once you know how to make metal, those are simple things, okay? Tractors and machine guns, the factories, steam engines, the complex technology is very, very recent. And what do we get for it? Our high stress life expectancy is 80 or more years. We get medicine, we get so many things, we get trade, we get all. If you don't think things are, you could say, I'll give up all my things, I'll give up all my technology to go back for a simple life. Well, what you're not going to get is the years. So probably the biggest thing we get from all the technology and not being hunters and gatherers is life. Living up to 80. And even in life expectancy all over the world has increased just because of the technology. Some countries more than others, but everywhere in the world more than hunting and gathering. So that's the trade-off. Okay, question. What was apartheid? How did it affect Africa, and what caused it? Okay, very specifically, it affected South Africa, down here on the southern tip, the country of South Africa. Okay, before Africa was colonized by, in the 1800s, South Africa was settled by the Dutch in the 1600s, I believe, and 1700s. So for hundreds of years, there were native black South Africans and white Dutch settlers in South Africa. Okay, so black South Africans and white South Africans. The black South Africans were indigenous there for thousands of years, and then the white South Africans came around Columbus time. South Africa was taken over by the British during the scramble for Africa, when Africa was divided by the Europeans, but then the British left, leaving in the 1900s, leaving the black South Africans who were there from the beginning and the white South Africans who were there for a couple hundred years. And apartheid was when the white South Africans ruled the government, ran the government, and made discrimination laws. The discrimination laws were called apartheid. It was segregation based on skin color. Okay, the white South Africans put themselves on the top class. Then there were some Indians in South Africa, and they were put on a class lower than the white South Africans. And then the black South Africans were on the lowest class, and the laws segregated the black South Africans. And it was separate and unequal. There was not even pretending that land and schooling would be equal. It was separate and unequal. Now, why it's in our curriculum? Because there's discrimination and prejudice in a lot of countries. Why South Africa is in our curriculum is because it was not unique, but it was very few countries had a minority, because there was a lot less white South Africans ruling and segregating over a large majority of people. So a very few, small percentage of the country was, the word is oppressing, a large portion of the country, and it was based on skin color, and it lasted so long into the early 1990s, whereas other countries ended their segregation in like the 1960s and the 1970s. It kept going in South Africa into the world of the 1990s, and it was unbelievably glaring how bad it was and how racist it was. And so for those reasons, it gets into our curriculum as as a look how long this racism, legal racism went, and look how people had to fight over years to end it. And it's an example of how recent segregation was in the world. Or not in the world, but in places in the world. So, the vocabulary. Oh, what caused it? What caused it? The white South Africans wanted money, so they wanted the good jobs, they wanted the government, they wanted to control the country, and racism. So that's what led them to control the black population and make those laws. That's what caused it. Desire for power and money. So Nelson Mandela is the revolutionary fighter. Wrong words. He was the fought for civil rights. There we go. He fought for civil rights, and he was imprisoned for decades. He was the symbol of the resistance movement for civil rights, and he was finally released from jail and became the first voted black president of South Africa. Bishop Desmond Tutu was a religious figure who also fought to end apartheid, and F.W. de Klerk was the last white president of South Africa who also dismantled apartheid and called for free elections. So these three were instrumental in creating free elections and getting rid of the segregation. And it was a world effort too. In the 1990s, there were boycotts. There was world pressure from other nations for South Africa to change. It was world news at the time. Further research into South Africa today, how it's going, because Nelson Mandela said, he said, we have climbed a great hill and we've got to the top of the hill. That's a great climb to get rid of apartheid. But he said there are more hills in the future. And what he meant was there's a lot of other problems, like racism. Okay, apartheid was gone, but the 1990s, the 2000s, and the 2010s, the racism is still there. Income inequality. Okay, because all that wealth was concentrated in the white minority for decades. And so Nelson Mandela knew that they would need to overcome that hill of income inequality. Schooling, the black South Africans had worse schools than the white South Africans for decades. So Nelson Mandela knew that education needed to come about. And so he said there was a lot more hills to overcome and climb up. The struggle didn't end when apartheid went away. So how is South Africa today? And also further research, if you're familiar, Dave Matthews is from South Africa. So his story, growing up with apartheid, he grew up in South Africa and the United States, and later formed with other people the Dave Matthews Band. So you can look to see how Dave Matthews reconciles with South Africa apartheid and what impact that had in his life. Okay, why did people protest the Vietnam War? I'm not an expert in this one. However, I do know some of the things that were going on at the time psychologically in the minds of people. But so this is going to be an incomplete explanation, but the parts that I'm throwing out there were part of the reason. There might be others out there that I don't know. So I'll give you the reasons that I know. So the 1900s pretty much was a decade of a lot of the United States wars. And two of them were really big. And the third was pretty big too. And the Vietnam was getting into the fourth. So think about it. The U.S. went in World War I. And a lot of people were drafted into World War I, and they went and they fought World War I. And now World War I, there was some enthusiasm for it. It was, but it was Europe's war. The U.S. got in for a couple years, and it was big. Then, shortly after, there's World War II. Once again, the U.S. goes into a war in Europe and Japan because of the attack on Pearl Harbor, two-front war. People were drafted. World War II was much more seen as, quote, fighting evil, fighting Hitler, and fighting the Japanese that had attacked the United States. Okay, so there was clear enemies, clear reasons. The reasons were crystal clear why World War II was being fought. Even so, that the reasons were crystal clear. There were still people that didn't want to get involved in World War II. But for the vast majority, maybe not majority, many Americans, the reasons why were crystal clear in their mind. But then in the 1950s, we had the Korean War. And this is just a decade and a half later, okay? And the Korean War was a little bit less threatening to the United States. There was a threat in World War I. There was a threat in World War II. Well, really, what was threatening the United States in Korea? But because it was North Korea versus South Korea, communists versus non-communists. So there was a threat of communism, but not directly in the United States. Okay, but it was a United Nations directed war. So it wasn't just the United States, it was the United Nations went to the war and the US was part of it. But once again, there was a draft. And so you see, again and again, more Americans were just being drafted, and it was becoming less and less of a threat to the United States, because when the Vietnam War came about, once again, a decade and a half later, I mean, you see, they're setting up this every 15 years, it's another war with another draft of American citizens. And now the Vietnam War was even less winnable than the Korean War, and the U.S. didn't win the Korean War. It never ended, and it was a stalemate, okay? Well, now the Vietnam War was even harder to win, even less of a threat than Korea to the United States itself, and it wasn't even declared as an official war. And there's other countries in there, but it wasn't like a United Nations sort of war. And so at this time, it's just snowballed. Years after years, a war after war, and a draft of the people. And so finally, faith in the war machine, and even former president says, beware the military-industrial complex, perpetual war of drafting young men, sending them over to die. Be careful, says a former president. And so finally, like, people, and it started with a lot of people, but young people especially, just said enough of this. You're taking away my right. You're drafting us for this war overseas, way over in Asia, and there's no clear threat in the U.S. To me, it seems like the citizens had just had enough. They had lost faith in the government, that the government would only go to a drafting war when absolutely necessary. So the faith was lost, and we get protests, and people protested the Vietnam War. So the vocabulary I take out of that is the draft, forced conscription of soldiers, and if you want to do further research, research selective service, because all males in the country, when getting to 18 years old by the federal government's definitions, have to sign up for selective service, and the selective service is what the U.S. will go to if there is a draft in the future. So do further research on selective service and see how there's push in Congress to open selective service to all sexes. All right, let's finish it up. How was electricity discovered and who discovered it? Oh gosh, I don't know. Something tells me Ben Franklin had something to do with it. Wasn't he was like invented a lot of things, and there's a key and a kite and a lightning strike. I don't know. I don't even know if that's true. Ben Franklin had something to do with electricity. I'll tell you what. Okay, so here's the thing. People have known about electricity forever. I mean, static electricity, right? Okay. Literally, there's been static electricity through all of humanity. So what is it? What is it? People have been wondering what that is, right? They know static spark. Okay, and I guess they might have been able to figure out lightning was electricity. I don't know, but at least they know the sparks. And there's some reports that the ancient civilizations could actually have made some early batteries types. And if you mix certain compounds to create a battery, you might get a slight shock, like battery terminal sort of thing. So they sort of figured that out. And then somebody was dealing with electricity and frogs. So look that up, right? There's definitely somebody who was doing frog research with electricity. I don't know, okay? Then wasn't it Mary Shelley with Frankenstein, right? Mary Shelley was Mary Wollstonecraft's daughter. The Enlightenment thinker Wollstonecraft had a daughter. She died before Mary Shelley ever really knew her. And Mary Shelley went on to become a writer that wrote Frankenstein. And didn't that use electricity to invigorate the monster, I think? That might have been before or after frog research. That would be interesting to find, because they zapped frogs with electricity. So someone had already created it, and then they made electric stimulus to the dead frog muscle. Edison and Tesla were the biggies in the United States, right? Edison, Thomas, and Tesla, Nikola Tesla, were both both into electricity. One was AC current, one was DC. Edison was alternating current, Tesla was direct current. Interesting. Electric Wars. Is there a movie about that? There might be a new movie about that, but whatever. Those are the two biggies back in the earlier Americas. All right, so further research. Zapping frogs with electricity. Dead frogs, don't worry. No, not live frogs. Van de Graaff generator. Go ask your science teacher if at school you have a Van de Graaff generator. You can really make your hair stand up somehow with it. Van de Graaff generator. Ask your science teacher. And really cheaply, you can get an electric ball that has like lightning and stuff in it. And then you can touch the ball and the lightning goes to your finger. I remember that being real fun growing up. They've got to be cheap on Amazon. So go look at your electric lightning ball on Amazon. There you go. Thanks for watching.